I wish people would believe teachers, whether it's with their stories or what they have to say. And then also knowing that, there's a high rate of burnout.
I've said this multiple times. As I look through all the occupations, the value of teachers is very much underappreciated because they're the ones teaching the next generation and raising the next generation. So they should have as much resources as possible to make sure the next generation of Americans, of kids, of next citizens know what they're doing as they come out of public education and live their life to whatever they decide to do. Welcome back to the Purple Political Podcast. My name is Riddell Lewis. I am your host today, and today we have a very interesting topic of discussion. As you guys know, we're here to have discussions, maybe debates, maybe solutions, but at the very end, compromise. Compassion is an important element because at the end of the day, just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean you have to be toxic and hateful. So today I got an excellent guest for me. Her name is Castella, so I'm gonna let her introduce herself, introduce what she's about, and go ahead, go for it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Riddell, for the introduction. So my name is Castella Copeland-Smith. I'm a former educator and teacher. I still do a lot of education work with the National Black Cooperative. We're a group that really focuses on flourishing for Black, Indigenous people of color. I'm also the vice chair for the Town of Windsor Human Relations Commission, where we also focus on having conversations about difficult topics and also to bring awareness and advocacy towards local issues within the Town of Windsor. Figure skater. I'm an alum to the University of Connecticut. I'm finishing up my doctorate with Liberty University, and I'm sure we're going to dive into a little more. I give little stories here and there, so that's just a little bit about me.
Okay, nice. I used to live in Connecticut. It's a pretty interesting area. Were you in Connecticut when UConn won for both men's and women's basketball championship?
Yes.
Yeah. That was an exciting time for Connecticut, considering they don't have any professional teams. But so with that said, we got a very interesting discussion we're going to talk about. Before we dive into kind of the meat and potatoes of everything, I want to know your general opinions about America's public education system.
I think my general opinion is that it needs to be redone. It is a hot mess, for lack of better terms. Like, that's the best way I can put it. I used to have a lot of hope for it, and I feel like parts of me still have little shards left, but there's just a lot that needs to be done, both politically, socially, and academically across all fronts. And I'm sure we're going to get into, as you call the meat potatoes, there's a lot of meat and potatoes and some questionable vegetables in there in the pot.
Fair enough. Would you say, in terms of currently, would you say you prefer private education versus public education as of right now?
I think as of right now, it depends on the district. There are some public education schools that are, I think, in my opinion, better than private. But again, it depends on the state, it depends on your town, it depends on the funding. There's a lot of different variables and factors. So I'd have to do research. But specifically in Connecticut, private tends to have more resources and funding. However, I grew up through a public education, so I'm kind of partial to it, especially with the town I'm in. But it depends. But I've seen great qualities in both.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've done mostly public education myself. When I went to college, I did go to a private institution, and I saw the benefits, and it's kind of laid out in terms of like the biggest issues for public institutions and private education. Certain ones tend to make sure to adhere to those problems and make sure they have the best education for their students. So as of right now, I fall more in line with private education is better in general terms, but I do agree it definitely depends on what institution you're putting your kids or yourself is going into. So I want to start off with this. Like one of the interesting topics to have, interesting discussions to have, is education inequality. I saw that, you know, your program, your group, one of the things that they talked about is education inequality and how it's a problem in America. So I want to start off by asking your opinion. What do you think about education inequality in general in America? And what do you think are some of the biggest reasons for education inequality in America?
I think a lot of the inequality stems from intersecting ideologies of oppression and discrimination. If you look at the history of the United States, we're on stolen land from the Native and Indigenous peoples. So when you see how they were building schools very similar historically to England and how exclusionatory it is, it's basically for the white, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, wealthy, male identifying person. And that narrative is still embedded within the policies and things that we see today. So I think that there's a lot of forms of intersecting oppressions, whether it's racism, classism, genderism, sexism, heterosexism, religionism, ageism. Like you keep going all day. So I think that those are larger forms of inequalities that are happening within education, as in addition to many other spheres as well. And then another part is seeing how policies either impact that with administrative actions or how the teachers take it within their hands themselves. And again, it varies depending on whether you're in a public institution, a private, a charter, or a magnet institution, and whether it is publicly funded, privately funded, for-profit, or nonprofit. So lots of variables to consider.
I generally agree. There's a lot of things to consider in terms of the issues for education inequality in America. One thing that I want to touch upon in terms of education inequality is the public schools. We want to stick with the public schools because, when it comes to private schools and charter schools, those are much more based on the persons that are setting up those schools. So in terms of society, they have no say into those situations. You pick what private school you want to send your kid, charter school you want to send your kid, and that's based on your personal ideology. So you can't really do anything about that. Public schools, for a matter, are a different matter that everybody should have a say in America. We all should have a say in that. Obviously, it's very much incorporated into the government. So when it comes to education inequality, I do agree in general that a lot of the inequalities in America obviously stems from the past, and how everything kind of built up today. As for today, I'm curious, are you saying that the biggest issues, you mentioned a lot of things like racism, classism, genderism, for example, do you think that it's mostly identity situations or mostly the fact that these people are in unfortunate situations, and because of that, the systems at the schools that they are in are basically just way worse compared to other schools because other people, mainly white people, mainly people who are growing up in suburban areas, throughout history, systematically, they had a better opportunity to go to these better schools compared to mostly black people are in these more poor areas, and they, for the most part, go to these worse schools. So would you say currently it's more of a situation where they're in bad situations, or would you say it's more a situation where their identities kind of keeping them from better education systems?
I would have to say identity only because it's nuanced. When I'm thinking about identity, it's who's had access to understanding who they are in this world. And the answer is not many, because it's an ongoing journey and it's an ongoing process. So who I used to be as a high school student, as a child, how I understood each of my intersecting identities is very different than how I understand myself now. So I first think about that for the students and the teachers and the administrators. And I really think, especially like to this day, like whether it's historically or currently, because historically people would just kind of overlook it and be like, oh, well, your regular student is like a white man. And it's like, well, that was the norm back in the day, is that Black, Indigenous people of color weren't supposed to be educated, is that they were seen as othered, and it was literally put into our legislation with the 3/5 compromise. If you look at like all these different policies and actions, you can see that that's happening. But thinking about how that impacts us today is, I think currently there's not enough resources for staff to understand how their identity can connect with other people. And I speak directly from my own experience with this, because the impact that teachers have not only in crafting like and helping students understand themselves is powerful. But if you don't know better, how can you do better? And if these teachers are taught like, oh, well, identity has nothing to do with it, let's just get to the curriculum, and you have a student who is literally mentally, physically, emotionally losing it, and you're like, how do I help them? And you sit down and see them as a whole child, as a whole person, that is how you have education, and that's how you make change, one person at a time. So I think currently a lot of this has to do not only with professional development, but with identity development and healing, because you can see that there's generational trauma from slavery, from police brutality, from gerrymandering and redlining, and how that impacts the way that schools are even set up. So when I think about it, that there's like a lot of healing that needs to happen. And Dr. Maya Akbar, a clinical psychologist, coined the term urban trauma, which really sums everything up, and where she talks about how like all this trauma from way back from the 1700s up to now, sometimes even the 1600s when you look back on the actual documents, is that like this is a big issue, and it's continuously being unaddressed, and it's impacting Black, Indigenous students of color, but also white students as well. Look at the amount of shootings that happen to this day, and it's not just a conversation that students of color need to have. It's a community conversation on race, on trauma, on understanding one another and meeting each other where we're at, because people don't realize it's like, I can disagree with you, but I don't have to hate you. I don't have to continue that bias, that cycle that continues to perpetuate oppression and discrimination. It's like, I can actively choose to change, but I have to have the resources and the people around me that I choose to surround myself with. And sometimes I don't even have that choice. There are communities, they don't have that choice, and that's okay. But like, how can we better that conversation and make learning accessible to a wider audience, whether it's students, teachers, staff, Black people, white people, mixed people, gay, straight, all the different kinds. How can we have that conversation instead of saying, well, like, it's not popular to come to an agreement. It's better if I, stoke the fire because this is what's hot, So that's my thoughts. That's a lot.
No, I understand where you're coming from. I do think there's something to be said in terms of the mental capacity of this newer generation. And you could touch upon the fact that, the generational trauma is an aspect. You also could touch upon the fact with this newer generation, considering technology and social media and the different relational aspects of people nowadays in America, is creating a lot of mental illness issues for all young people, and they don't know how to deal with that. That is something that you can definitely touch upon. One of the things that when I was doing my research about education inequality, I saw like different reasons why education inequality is so bad. One of the things that we obviously probably agree on is that a lot of these areas where it's majority Black people, because of like systematic racism, is that they're in very impoverished situations, so it's hard for them to get out of those situations. But when we're talking about the institutions themselves, public education, some of the more interesting, some of the solutions needs to be created or needs to address specific problems. One of the things they talked about is that a lot of these public educations that in these urban areas, impoverished areas, one of the big things about it is that these classes, the size of schools are very large. There's a lot of people. The classes are very large. There's a lot of people. So in terms of one of the solutions is that we need smaller classrooms, smaller classes. But even that's very tough. So one of the biggest solutions that people recommend is better teachers. And I know you mentioned earlier that we need more aware teachers. In general, more educated teachers, because a lot of these teachers that are just graduated from like school, they are sent to these areas. They don't really have experience, and they're forced in areas where they don't have the experience to know how to deal with these kids, while also being forced to kind of be a newbie and teach kids that inherently, some of them, a good number of them probably, want to learn, but then others do not. So when it comes down to it, what is the singular, I know you mentioned a lot of things, but what do you think is the first thing that we should touch upon in terms of bettering these public institutions? Is it the classrooms? Is it the teachers? Or is there something else that you can consider?
I think a lot of this has to, there's a lot of moving parts. And I think a part of it is, and I used to think how I conceptualized it was a little different, but I think it's equal parts students, parents, teachers, and the administration. And here's why. The reason why is administrators have a responsibility to report to the state, do all this stuff, but the state is pressuring them to act a certain way, which then pressures the teachers, and then that trickles down to the students and parents. So there's that big dynamic going on where it's like, will I get support as a teacher from my administration? And for some of them, yeah, cool. For most urban schools, you're on your own. It's like you jumped into an ocean full of sharks willingly. Like, or maybe you didn't know. Like, all these new teachers are just like, I did not know I had to tread water, like fend off the sharks and teach a class for 8 subjects. Like, what did I sign up for? You know, so there's that dynamic. Then there's the teacher's dynamic. Sure, you can be qualified. I know I graduated from NEAG, and this is great, which is a great school for education. But I wish I was trained on conflict management, on the not just for teachers and administrators, but for students, teaching them hard skills, emotional skills, teaching cultural intelligence, whether it's my own learning or for my students. Also, being an advocate. That's something where, like, advocacy, like, you need to stand up for yourself and for your students, because there will be so many barriers. So I think there's the teacher component. The parent component is accountability. There is no discipline, or I should not say no, but there's very little discipline for student misbehavior. I'll give you an example. For other schools, I've taught at a lot of different schools, and one of the schools I taught at, a kid would hit you with a chair and nothing would happen. Nothing. You will have bruises. You will have, some people had to get stitches and then come back the next day. Nothing happened. Just the kid's like, oh, well, you know, I had an outburst. This is that, da, da, da. And then you just move on like nothing happens. So there's no accountability from the parents or the school. And then also to the students, there's this whole notion of, oh, no, I don't want to traumatize them by telling them no. Oh, no, I don't want them to have a negative experience so that, you know, they'll develop mental health problems. But guess what? By not allowing them to learn from their mistakes, from their experiences, we're feeding the mental health problem. And that's something that no one's really talking about, or at least not talking about enough, is that there's not enough discipline and accountability. And that has to be triangulated with students, teachers, and parents. All have to be on the same page, where the teachers used to be like, look, like, this is what's going on. Parents, I need your support. Parents from like the 80s and the 90s would be like, yep, got you, got my kid. We're going to get this straightened out. But then a shift happened in the early to mid 2000s where all of a sudden everything's always the teacher's fault, even if it's from an angry outburst or a violent outburst from the students. And it's like, well, I'm just letting you know here. And then the parents saying it's my fault for everything, whether that's true or not. And then you try to go to people for help and everyone's like, no, you're fine, keep going. But when it's every day, and when you have these large class sizes, and you like if you have like a class of 23, 25 kids, and there's so many needs, like each person has so many needs, and you're teaching 8 subjects, and like you're coming in early, you're staying late, you're putting in hundreds of your own dollars just to be told you're not good enough. That's the big problem. How can you get teachers to stay when you get treated like that? And and like, don't get me started about teacher trauma, but that's a whole other thing, because like that's the reason why people are leaving. Like, would you want to work in a job like that? Like, where you get like physically, emotionally, and verbally like hurt every day?
Yeah. I mean, I've said it multiple times that the value of teachers is underappreciated and they get not enough pay. I've said that multiple times. But I want to separate the 4 things that you mentioned. In terms of parents, in terms of the public education system, they can't do anything. They can't tell the parents what to do. So they have no say what the parents are going to do. In terms of the students, that is a very interesting question. So this is a situation I wanted to ask you. There's a school in the Midwest, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it. There's a school in the Midwest. Recently, they just passed a bill. It's a small area, a very small, like, townish area. Recently, they passed a bill to reintroduce spanking kids. And they are only allowed to do that with the parents' permission. The parents has to sign a permission slip and go like, okay, now teachers are allowed to do this. I don't know if this stems to like high school or anything, but I know at the very least it has like elementary school, maybe middle school. I'm not really sure. Don't remember. But the school's implementing this system so they can discipline these kids in a way to help kind of put them in their place, so to speak. So they're like getting proper punishment. So this is a situation to kind of, it makes it interesting based on like, okay, if the parents are not doing, sorry about that, but if the parents are not doing anything, are the teachers supposed to in this specific situation? So what do you think about this school allowing or bringing back this system? Obviously they're doing it with parents' permission, but what do you think about it in general?
I think it'd be interesting because I know to your point about the parents can't really do anything at the school for the public level, which is true. But at home, they can do all sorts of things. So again, it's not every parent who will not like do something. Like there are some that will take action. It's interesting that you bring up the spanking because that's what sometimes people will do to like, make sure that there's a disciplinary action. I think personally, like especially for students for the younger age, I think psychologically it causes a lot of damage, but socially it may be helpful. But I think again, it depends on each student because there are some students who may respond to that and have a better respect and authority for the teacher, and then there are others who will shy away and will cause other issues. So I think it really depends on the demographic, the culture, like the household culture, and also the school culture. If is it an urban or suburban or rural setting? Because the three of those settings, even across public schools, let me tell you, they're all very, very different. So I think for some settings it might work, and for others it might not. But maybe, I'm glad that they're trying something new. But I think like some sort of disciplinary, like action or accountability needs to be had in education, because right now it's nothing. Like for some schools there's just nothing.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious on your general thoughts about that because it was an instance of the public education trying to take discipline in their own hands, for example. So let's touch upon the three things a little bit more specifically. So you talked about administration and, the administration getting their act together. For the most part, the administration is very much dictated on like the public education policies that's going on in the area. So, it's really depending on like, how much funding they're getting, what quotas they have to meet based on like test scores. For example, in Texas, there's something called the STAR test that like every kid has to take, and it has to just make sure they equate to the scores and all that stuff. So for you, I'm curious, what do you think the administration should be doing? Especially, it's mostly these urban areas for the education inequality. Suburban areas are fine. Rural areas, they're a bit different, but urban areas are where the education inequality is mostly had, because a lot of these impoverished areas are in urban settings, for example. So what do you think the administration should be doing to kind of mitigate this inequality situation?
Yeah, I think before I answer the question, I think rural, and this is something that people don't talk about as much, the data actually shows that rural schools do worse than urban schools in some areas. That if you actually look at all three of them, the news and the people like to politicize and highlight the urban schools and this and that. And while I do agree that there's a lot going on with urban schools, the rural schools get left behind. They get forgotten about. They get the 30-year-old textbooks that people don't look at anymore. There's a lot of other issues. So I think depending on what state you're looking at, there are some rural schools that are actually more impoverished and treated more with like more inequality because of where they're located, and that has to get into the geopolitics and social aspects. I just wanted to highlight that. But also, regardless of the geographical location for urban, suburban, or rural, the administration, I think, needs to do more socially and not be driven as much by the politics. And what I mean by that is like everyone, a lot of the people that I see nowadays are like, oh, well, like we got to get this money so we can like fund this and then this. And I was like, and yes, I agree, we need that money. But at the same time, you need to address these students where they're at. Like if you expect that we have an increase of neurodiverse and physically disabled kids, then, and you want to have like these high test scores, but then that test is different than the standard test. And then you like, there's just like, you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of these variables don't really antiquate to showing their growth, their strength, their emotional and academic intelligence. The tests aren't really serving like what they actually know. So when you look at it, I'm like, okay, so we have a metric that is failing our students, yet we use that to help with our funding and money. And why have we not changed the way that we calculate or measure like intelligence in academics? You know what I'm saying? Because a lot of the people out there just think, oh, well, SATs, ACTs, GMATs, GREs, and like all these standardized tests and all this stuff and the Common Core and all those things. Like that's great, but that doesn't like measure the growth that someone might have from year to year, or even from like kindergarten to fifth grade. Those tests, like some of them, like it just doesn't add up. And yet that's where the money's coming in. Oh, well, we hit this standard here, so like let's keep going. And it's like, I think it's like you're asking a fish to climb a tree. But now it's not just a fish, it's a dolphin and it's a shark, and we're all in the same districts of public schools. And it's like, did no one say, hey, this tree here is not working at all? Like, did anyone question this? Or how can we come up with better metrics? And that's a lot, especially within higher education as well. You can find some parallels. It's kind of like, well, we need to maybe reassess and find something, whether it's a standardized test or whether it's a project where students can have a project where they share what they've learned, and then we have a standardized rubric or a standardized something else that's not what we have right now. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. And I think that the administration specifically needs to support the teachers, the community, and the stakeholders who will be big implementers in creating whatever is coming next, because that's going to be the key, is like making sure it's not only we have a convincing argument, but also that, yes, I have your support, knowing that when we push this through, this is for the betterment of our students and our community, and that way people can actually flourish.
So are you saying the administration should, from what it sounds like, the administration should stop focusing on testing, but more focusing on the growth of the students? Is that what it sounds like?
Yes, but the hard part is, I know as administrators that they have a lot going on and they have to focus on testing because that's where the money's coming in. So I think this actually has to get to a larger level at the state and the political level as to how are we supporting our students better, because there's more money going into the military than education. And I'm like, well, there you go. Like, if you look at how we're spending it as a nation and where our values lie, if you compare the United States to China or other countries, their students have phenomenal test scores and how they're like moving on in life and doing all these things. And it's like, if you look in our country, the reason why ours isn't like that, it's because like we're not investing in the next generation for their education, for whether it's emotional, physical, mental, academic. Like we're not investing as a society. When I say we, I'm talking about a society. We're not investing in them, and that's a big part of the issue. So I think at this point it's beyond the administrators. They're trying to do the best they can and bless their hearts, but it's hard, and a change needs to happen. But I think it needs to come from a higher level. When you move up from the town level, then the town council, then the local government, like the governor and the mayors, and then you get to the state, and then the federal, and then the national level.
Yeah, one thing to touch upon that is that a lot of it should be falling upon the people around in the community, because a lot of them, their voices should be heard in terms of the public education and making sure that these schools are doing what they're supposed to. I do agree in general in terms of like the funding. There has been multiple kind of insinuations that when it comes to public education funding, it's not being utilized appropriately, and it's not. You don't even have to point it all the way to like the military, because sure, we got a large military and all that stuff, but in general, the public education, the funding that's specifically supposed to go to public education, it's been said multiple times that it's not being utilized properly and efficiently, and that's a big problem as well. So in terms of the administration, generally, I agree that they are very much victims of what our local governments, what our state governments, what our federal government does. With that said, let's touch upon teachers a little bit. So what do you think the teachers should be doing, or in regards to teachers in general, what do you think the solution should be in reference to teachers and fixing education inequality?
I think for teachers, it's like nuanced, but my main thing is I wish people would believe teachers, whether it's with their stories or what they have to say. And then also knowing that, there's a high rate of burnout, and that burnout is caused by a lot of different factors. And sure, some teachers work harder than others and all that jazz. But I think a part of it needs to come with listening to a teacher when they say, hey, this new curriculum, it doesn't work for my class. Can I modify this to help with this success, whether it's for the test or the concepts? And I think for teachers, it's mainly making sure that their voices are heard, because teachers have had to be a lot of different things for their classes. They've had to be like a mentor, they've had to be a friend, they've had to be a therapist at some points, and it's like we've had to be all these different things. And of course, it depends on each school. But at the end of the day, it's just teachers need more support. And that's where I kind of slightly disagree with the budget that you were talking about before, because sure, they have a large enough budget and yeah, they need to be spending it better. But a part of it is they're not spending it on having a competitive salary. If you look at it, some teachers are not getting paid well, which that's sure a part of it. But also a part of it is then maybe hire more people. Think about the model that you have. Like these budgets right now, sure, they could be changed and stuff, but I think that they do need more funding, because then you can have a 2-teacher model where you have a main teacher and an associate teacher, and then they work together. So the 2 teachers can then help with a class size of like 25, right? So when you start to look into the nitty gritties, I think a lot of it is more systematic, and a lot of it is at the larger level, because people people need to start realizing that there are other models out there. We've had this same model of education for like a long time. The Bell system is like synonymous with like the work system and the factories. Homework was used as a punishment, and yet we still have homework for students as like a supplemental thing. But when you look at it, the intentionality of homework was a discipline measure, but people lost that history over time. So it's things like that. As a teacher, you have to reevaluate what is needed socially, culturally, but then also academically, because that changes from classroom to classroom. And every year you come in with new students, new needs, new parents, new things to explore and understand. And I think a lot of the teachers, whether you're in a public or rural school, it's not only a matter of access to resources, which yes, funding helps with, but it's also knowing how to use them, because that's also another big issue within urban and rural schools specifically, is that there's a technology gap. That technology is a big skill that you have to have within the workforce, but also it's a skill that not all teachers are brought on board. If you look at some of the teachers who've been there for like 40, 50 years, and they're like, I don't know how to do all this technologically savvy things, and you want me to do a whole course online, or you need me to prep all the curriculum and everything's online. So making sure that our teachers are adequately equipped with the skills that they need, instead of just throwing them in, being like, figure it out. Like some teachers, sure, it'll work, but for others, it's taking that time to invest within their own learning and professional development. So again, a lot of different layers going on, but in general, I think that teachers aren't being heard at all.
Okay. Well, I've said it prior. I agree that the teachers is a valuable occupation that's not getting enough funding, that's not getting enough pay, it's not getting enough support, as you said. I've said this multiple times. As I look through all the occupations, the value of teachers is very much underappreciated, because they're the ones teaching the next generation and raising the next generation. So they should have as much resources as possible to make sure the next generation of Americans, of kids, of next citizens know what they're doing as they come out of public education and live their life to whatever they decide to do. With that said, so it sounds like obviously they need more funding, they need more resources, and in terms of the administration, very similarly. So are you saying, it sounds like one of the big things for these systems, public education, is that they're not getting enough funding and resources to teach properly. But you did mention something in regards to students in general and parents. Obviously, what the students learn is obviously dependent on the teacher's skills and the funding and resources they have. But do you think anything should be said to I know you touched upon it a little bit, but you can expand upon it to the students, the parents, and the culture of how students treat teachers, for example. Do you think there's something to be said about the other side of the coin that's not like funded related, but more on a personal level for the students coming into schools?
Yeah, actually, I think that the main issue too within across like all levels of education and all the different types is that there's a disrespect for teachers, whether it's because you're black or because you look young. That perception of who or what you look like is a huge towards students. So I know that there's a general disrespect for teachers being like, oh, my parents said I don't have to listen to you because like, you know, if you offend me in any way, then I don't have to do this. That's what they said. And I'm just sitting here, I'm like, how are you going to get through life communicating that way? Just imagine if you invited that student here and you had a disagreement, like that's the end of the conversation. Like, how do you bridge that gap? And that is the issue that many teachers are facing to this day, where it's just like you're trying to communicate with the parents and the students, which, by the way, for some of them, it comes from both. It's like a two package deal where like both student and parent are disrespectful, even though it's like, hey, I've been here a long time. It's like, we don't care. And it's like, oh, okay, like how do we navigate this? Because I'm trying to educate you, yet you're not willing to walk with me while I'm educating you. So that disrespect is a huge piece. But also there's a sentiment culturally and socially that education isn't really cool and that people aren't investing as much as they used to. So for example, like back, you know, I speak from my own experience. Back when I was growing up, you know, people were like, yeah, go to college, do this and this. And like, this is why education is important. And because of my parents, like I will be forever grateful for my parents. They said like, your education is something that no one can take away from you. You can only grow and go up from there. But I had to be explicitly taught repetitiously over time, over different versions of myself about the importance of education. And that's not happening. And I get it that there's this narrative of, oh, well, college isn't for you or this isn't for you and da 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 da. But that narrative is mainly told to impoverished people, people who don't have a lot of money, or to Black, Indigenous students of color. So when you look at the disparity of who is being told what, it's kind of like, this is interesting. So not as many people are investing in their education. But well, the irony is that in order to make a livable wage, or not even like beyond a livable wage, like that's the true value. You need to have that education, even if it's an associate's. That gives you a step up. Minimum wage in Connecticut is $15 as of 2022 or 2023. And that's great, but that's still not livable. It really isn't, because Connecticut is one of the top 10 states out of the entire United States that has the highest taxes and is one of the highest places like where everything's super expensive to live, you know?
Yeah,
So
for
that's
sure.
something that people don't like take into account. And when people are like, oh, well, you know, like I don't want to go to college, and I'm like, that's fine. You can go into the working world, but you're going to struggle to be able to pay rent, to buy groceries, to live life the way that you want to. And yet here in our public education system, we're not teaching the next generation. This is why you go to college. This is why, even if it's community college, that's fine. Like, you know, there are a lot of programs too, where it's like you get your first 2 years free. Like that's like asinine when I think about it. It's like you get your first 2 years free in a lot of urban schools, and students either aren't aware of it or aren't taking advantage of it, or I don't care, I want to become a YouTube influencer, because look at what they're doing. And that's one of the hardest jobs, because you're a social entrepreneur and there's a lot of business and relationships and finance. There's like all this stuff behind it, but they don't see that. They just see like, oh, the likes and the money. Wow, I want to do that. So I think we really need to have our next generation invest in education. And education is not just the standard, oh, I go to school. It can also be online platforms. It can be going to community events. So the learning environment is really expanded to where you learn. And it can be in a lot of ways, whether it's going abroad, whether it's from family or friends, or even media and TV shows. There's a lot of different ways that people can learn. So just continuing to have students invest in themselves and value their education. That's the key part, is people aren't valuing it because, oh, it's not popular or this or that. But then 10 years later, oh, I have to go back to school. And it's just kind of like, wait, you graduated high school 10 years ago and you're doing all this stuff and you basically like floundered for a bit and now you're going back. And it's like things like that. It's like we could have avoided this, but I'll just stop there.
No, I definitely think that is for the most part that is definitely the case. I've talked about there's a huge like cultural perception that is very flawed currently in these areas. But I'm curious about your question, your answer to this. So there are parents and there are students, even in these impoverished areas. We know that there's a lot of examples throughout society that do want to go to school, that do want to go to college, that do want the best for their kids. Now, there are programs put in place, some of them in certain states. One example is like you can get a tax credit to put your kid in private school. Another thing is in Texas, in terms of the funding that technically goes to schools from your taxes, there's potentially, I don't know how official this is going to be. I know there's a proposal out for it right now, but reclaiming that money and utilizing that money to put your kid in a charter school instead will be an option. So the alternative for some of these areas would be, okay, I don't want my kid in this public education system, but I want them to succeed. I'd rather them be in a private and charter school instead. So what do you say to those people who kind of abandon the public education system to make sure that they're going to these institutions with the good teachers, with the small classrooms, with the challenging curriculums, with the projects helping character growth, stuff like that? So what do you say to those people who are doing that, and do you think that is kind of the better solution now at this point?
I think, and I've had to talk with some people recently about this, so it's a great question. I think my response is that's great if you can afford it, because when you look at private and charter schools, the amount of money each year for the tuition and all of those things, it's like it's a lot. It's like if you are from a single income household, or if you're from a low income, unless you're on scholarship, like how are you going to get to that avenue of better education without money? And that's purpose. That's very purposeful too, because they actually have many private and charter schools have accountability papers where like parents and students are held accountable. So like if you have too many instances of behavior or academic problems, they kick you out. It's just like that's just that. We can't do that in public education, but people don't realize that. So when there's families like, oh, I'm gonna go here or there, and I'm like, one, be prepared for culture shock. Two, be prepared that it's gonna be a lot of money, like a lot more than you think. And then three, can you withstand the cultural shift and the academic shift? Because the academic pressure in private and charter schools is very different than public schools. And that is kind of great, but also it can add newer nuances. Like let's say you come from public education and like all of a sudden you get put in this environment. It's like I went from not caring about my education to now everyone around me is like they eat, sleep, and breathe it for breakfast. Like they're going for like to the like academic Olympics, like, you know? So that's the thing that's really interesting to me is it's like, great. Like, honestly, you have more resources because there's more money being put into it. There's class sizes. There's like all sorts of great things. But again, there's that caveat. And there's also a caveat that like with a lot of private and charter schools, again, it depends on the area and the institution that you're going to face a lot of racism, a lot of xenophobia, a lot of sexism, a lot of those things that people won't talk about and that you'll just dismiss. So that's going to be another form of trauma that you're going to kind of have to either think about or you're just going to jump into and be like, I didn't know that I was swimming with the sharks. So there's that parallel between the public and the private in that regard. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about there. And there's also mis and disinformation. Misinformation and disinformation largely stem from like, oh, well, you think one thing's super better and all this stuff. And if you do the research and you're not doing the research from credible sources, you're going to have a rude awakening when you come and like, yeah, I'm going to go do this. And it's like, wait, this is nothing like what I thought. And you see this whether it's with political elections and with education, especially with education, whether it's with public, private, or charter. Like you might be promised or said for one thing, and then the whole thing is implemented and done another way. So that's where you have to be an educated consumer, learning like, how do I find a credible source? How do I vet this person or this institution? How can I find actual credible forms of feedback from people who look like me, from people who don't look like me? How can I be able to navigate those financial burdens? Does, like, some institutions won't even offer financial aid because they're like, oh, if you need financial aid, like, we don't need you, and that's the response. I've seen that happen, because let me tell you, it's happened. I've tried to, like, apply, and I'm like, wow, I'm so not going here. But it's things like that that people don't see up front.
Understandable. However, I will say this, that I think a lot of the things you said, definitely in terms of like the live, breathe, education, achievement, it being very strenuous. I mean, for the most part, that's what education's supposed to be. I mean, education's not
Yeah.
supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be strenuous in order for you to be challenged to grow in your intelligence. It's supposed to be difficult. In terms of the social and cultural shock, I definitely think that's definitely going to be a shock. But one of the things you could say is, obviously, like you said, you could do research to make sure your kid goes to a school that's cultural diverse, or if you want them to be in a specific, more cultural or ethnic school, ethnically black, ethnically white, ethnically Hispanic, you just send them to that school, for example, if that's really what you want. It's everybody else's personal preference. It doesn't really matter to me. But in a lot of those situations, even in public education, you'll get a lot of that anyway. There's a lot of bullying in public education, and a lot of different reasons. And like you said, even the teachers get bullied, and they can't even do anything about it. So a lot of the issue, there's nothing perfect. There's always going to be issues. For example, one thing that you did say that is very true is paying for the schools, especially for these impoverished areas. It's going to be tough to do so. So if they did create a program that is, sure, it's going to be still relatively tough, but at the very least feasible for your kid, as long as they do well in school and do not like waste the education system's time, and they create a program that's feasible for people who are in the lower income end to at the very least put their kid in that education system, would you be okay with that if it's at least feasible? Not like I'm just gonna give it to you, but at least feasible to a certain extent.
Again, I think it depends, because, like, even when you're saying waste of time, but, like, whose time? The schools or the
Yes.
families? And at the end of the day,
Well,
it's
both.
kind of like, yeah, exactly. It's kind of, is it both? Is it one or the other? And then when you look at feasibility, it depends on your location. Like, when you're saying, like, oh, you can just go to another school. It's like, not in my state. Like, like all the private and charter schools, I don't know if you take a look, there's not one that is primarily Latinx, Latinine, or Black, Indigenous people of color dominated, unless you look at the old historic charter schools, which are now put on like for museum for when they were colonizing the indigenous people of our land. So when I look at it, that's the only way I kind of slightly agree. I'm like, you would have to move states to find someone or find an institution that actually like better represents yourself. And the closest one is by the New York border. And it's like, do you really want to like move halfway or nearly all the way across like to the other side of Connecticut for a better education? And to be honest, like, I can't answer that question. That depends on the family. Some families are like, yes, that is worth it. And there's other families where they're like, no, what are some other options? And the one that we haven't talked about is magnet. And the magnet schools are a unique solution because it's like in the middle of a charter and private school and also a public school. It's like sandwiched right here in the middle. So some of them, again, like depending on the state, some of them are really great. And again, like across all school types and all grade levels, yeah, there'll be bullying and mental health issues and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, are you in a community where you can feel supported, where you can be seen, where you feel like, oh, I am represented, not just with my identity, but ideologically, academically, emotionally? Will I be able to have people who will help support me in my growth? If they say it takes a village, that's an anonymous quote, takes a village to raise a child. But what village are you going to put yourself in? Or do you even get to choose your village or who you surround yourself with within the towns? And that's one of the challenging parts within the urban school districts. I know, especially within Connecticut, it's kind of like, how can you balance everything when everything's so close? And with the funding and how some people who have access to the funding aren't spending it equitably, and some people are, and then there's like all these different nuances, and then the gang violence, and how does that play into the whole narrative of inequality in education? Because that's a big factor is violence, whether it's at home, on the streets, right outside of the school, which has happened before, where it's like, well, how does this impact the way we learn? And how does that literally, it neurologically and cognitively changes the way you understand yourself and like intake information? People don't realize like that's what trauma and grief and these heavy emotions do, and yet people don't talk about it. And that's also a part of the inequality narrative.
Okay. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that was said so far in terms of schools. I think private school is a very interesting solution. Charter school is a very interesting solution, in addition to magnet schools. All of them have very interesting solutions for people. But at the end of the day, we got to focus on what's realistic. But they were just proposals for a lot of people. But what's more realistic at the end of the day for like these impoverished areas is sending them to these huge public schools with a lot of students and with these teachers, of course. So, and the big classrooms and all that stuff, right? So that's just the most realistic solution. So in general, I want to ask this before I ask my follow-up question, because what are some positives in terms of current public education system that you think should be mentioned for these more impoverished areas? We're not focused on the suburban areas, but more these urban areas. Rural, I know you said rural is like in a more unfortunate situation, but they're also harder to deal with because they have the way less amount of people. It's scattered around, and for the most part, giving funding to a school that's incredibly tiny, it's always going to be a hard buy. It's like, okay, can you give this school, like, oh, they barely have any people. It's like, but compared to this urban school has a lot of people, it's like, okay, can you give them this? It's like, probably, but that, and then the dynamics of doing it properly and all that stuff. So rural schools are hard to figure out because it's just these smaller areas creating education. Of course, they're going to have worse resources, but it's just harder to kind of figure out a solution for those. Urban areas, I think needs to be focused on more so purely because of the amount of people. I think that's the biggest difference, because the amount of people that is affected in comparison. But I'm not saying rural areas do not need help. I'm just saying they're harder to figure out a solution for because of the amount of people that's actually affected. So in terms of these public education for these urban areas, what do you think? Is there any positives that you would want that you can say in terms of public education for these impoverished urban areas?
Yeah, I think some of the positives include having more social emotional learning curriculum, which really focuses on understanding how to process emotions. Also more on diversity and inclusion. Like I remember I taught a pre-K class about different understanding race, and they loved it. It was wonderful. And they were like 3 and 4. And I was like, I had some great conversation. You should talk to a 3 or 4-year-old about like race sometime. It's like mind opening. It's so cool to see like their understanding. And cognitively and scientifically, they like children who are 3 and 4 already have a sense of identity. Sure, it's not fully done yet, but they already have their sense of gender and race by the time they're 3 and 4. So that's something that people don't realize, that the world around them impacts that. And specifically within urban schools, I know that, yes, there is more people, but I also think a lot of the issues and the positives with urban schools is that there are teachers who care, that the curriculum is changing, so people are starting to learn the real history of the United States of America. People are starting to have complicated conversations about growing from the inside out. That's one of the best things in public education, is that more of that is happening. Is the curriculum 1619 is out, where it really dives deep into telling the real story of American history. Because I don't know about you, in public education, they used to just be like colonialism. It was bad. Here's a bunch of white people, and then like they'd just be like, oh yeah, the black people poured them, and moving on 1800s, and it's just kind of like, is that really all that happened? Like, you're not going to talk about like everything else that happened from the slave side, the political side, the social side. So I think that that's a big win for public education. And there's actually a lot of Southern groups right now that are fighting against that, saying like, no, we need to keep the history books the way that we had it before, which I can understand that. But at the same time, then how are we going to teach this next generation to invest in their education and the truth, to invest in understanding themselves holistically without knowing and connecting the past? Because I am the result of my roots, of my family's roots, of my ancestry. We have to understand that, even if it's uncomfortable, it's getting comfortable with being uncomfortable and then learning from it. That's where the learning happens, is when, oh, I have a disagreement, but let me sit with it. Let me understand it and air it out. And that's going to become my new door to learning new things. So that, again, the emotional learning and the new curriculum developments have been great. Also, creative problem-based learning has been great. I think that would be a best solution for public education, is to restructure it so that a lot of the students are getting to learn more through play, so that they're getting to understand these concepts with hands-on experiences, with writing, with reading, with drawing, with getting that creativity with math and science and social studies and emotions. Like that's where that happens. So I think a lot more creative problem-based learning could happen. But I also am grateful for the creativity that's coming. The pandemic, if anything, taught us to take a step back and get creative. And something public education is doing very well is taking technology to the next level. It's having students who now have access to more resources online that they can access at home, at the library, at school. It's creating new opportunities to understand information in a wide variety of differentiated ways. And that's what we have to do as educators. You differentiate the information across different learning levels and abilities. So that's another highlight. And then finally, the last one, which is positive behavior intervention systems within public education, or PBIS for short. And this system really enforces positive behavior by focusing on the positive instead of the negative. So really like rewarding students. Wow, like you got your work done on time. You're treating others kindly, explicitly teaching kindness and rewarding them. You were nice to another person. Why don't we celebrate that? Celebrate the small moments, the joy of, wow, I answered these problems and I didn't get one wrong, or, oh, I got one wrong and I learned from it. That's great. So really focusing on that positive. And sometimes it can be hard, but that has really helped, like us, like across the school climate and culture, that has really helped make a tremendous difference. So those are just a couple that I'll highlight.
Yeah, it definitely sounds very good for the most part, from how you kind of stating it, right? A lot of interesting ideas is coming from it. So the next question I want to ask is, I want to separate two things again, and obviously it would be the students, the parents, and the cultural mindset of education, public education, versus the institution itself, the teachers and the administration. What do you think needs to be changed first? Do you think that the mindset of education, the willingness to go to education and better yourself and take it seriously and respect your teachers, should be the first thing to change? Or do you think the institution, in terms of funding the teachers better, getting more teachers and better curriculum, needs to change first? What do you think should be changed first? And one thing I also want to add, because it makes it very interesting, that obviously they both need to be hand in hand, right? But it's when you're coming up with a solution, you got to take things per step and figure out which should be the first domino to fall. And it's really hard to say as of right now, because if you compare it to like China, for example, or someone that's a lot less kind of communistic, a lot of these systems have students who care and very efficient education systems, because the efficient education system is going to better the students, and the students who care is going to propel the education system to continue to increase upon itself. So based on your personal opinion, there's really no right answer. What do you think should be changing first?
I think first, it's a great question, and second, I think that socially and culturally we need to change first, because you can have all the money in the world and it could make no difference. You can have all the money in the world, and if you don't have that mindset, or if you do not choose change, if you do not choose, I want to do this differently, then it doesn't matter. So a part of me is like, institutionally, like schools are trying to change, which is great. And then you get parents and students who are pushing back, which cool, I respect that. But then how are we supposed to move forward? I think it really needs to come from society, because education, once you're done with your education, you go off into society. You use your skills, whether you're aware of it or not. And a lot of it has to come from society saying, no, we want to be better, whether it is socially or culturally or academically. We need to start to think about like the implications. The consequence of not caring about education is that now you have a bunch of people in society who either don't know how to work or aren't skilled, or who want to work but then aren't qualified, or you get stuck with not knowing how to manage your money, or you're not knowing how to interact peacefully with people and getting arrested and things like that. It's like, it's really understanding the importance of it. So that's why a part of me feels like it initially needs to be like addressed socially and culturally, and then institutionally it can be addressed, because then you can put the money where the mouth is. It's like, oh, the people want this, like now I can start to put the money where the mouth is to create that change that they are looking for. So that's where I'm kind of coming from, and a lot of institutions are already moving that way, but are the people ready? And that depends on each society and each town and each state and stuff like that. Because let me tell you, in Connecticut, there are some towns and cities, we are ready for that change. And that's been great for urban and suburban schools. For rural, it's taking a while. Like I know, like you were saying before, that yes, it's very hard to identify an issue. They've even consolidated the schools so that there's like a couple hundred. So now you have an actual population, but it's like, how do we address these people that are often forgotten? You know, so when I think about the solution across the different types, it's very interesting. But having an open choice schools, I don't know if you've heard of that, but having open choice where people can choose to go to the school that is within their district or to schools outside of their district have been very helpful. So some urban students will actually leave their district in their urban setting and go to a suburban or rural school because their needs will be better met at those schools. Which again, it's messed up because it doesn't really solve the issue in the urban setting. But for some families, that has made a tremendous impact on students being able to better their own education, to choose their education and be like, wow, like I can now set a different path for my future. So that's just kind of where I'm at. It, again, like you were saying, it's a balancing act, but at the same time, it's a lot of work, and people I don't think are ready for the work. I know personally, I like to work hard and like, you know, make sure I put my heart and soul into it, but not everyone's ready to put in the work. And that's a big part of it, is we need people who will be like the soldiers, who will be able to contribute towards this change, whether it's on a policy side, whether it's on the school side for parent-teacher meetings, the PTOs, whether it is talking with teachers and having that advocacy. So there's a lot of different fronts, but then focusing on one. So that's why when I'm with some of my groups, I like to focus on education. And sure, it's broad, but I'm focusing on the one in my town. And that's the start.
Yeah, that's an excellent mindset to have. And for me, I agree. I think for the most part, it's very, very much a situation where it's like a mindset thing for a lot of these areas. Because at the end of the day, there's so much things you can do. Like you said, you can be a part of your community, create programs that is even separate but a part of the public education to help better these students specifically in a lot of different ways. I've created a whole, like for example, I've created like a whole template of specific ways to better the individual, because there's things in public education that's just not taught. For example, financial literacy, for example, in terms of general growth in terms of your mind, because I do think that they do not try to evolve your ideas enough. So there are things that the people can do in the communities, but it's a mindset thing. You can vote for specific public education bills that betters your system, your schools. And I didn't know about the what was it called?
Open choice
Program. I did not know about that, but I'm aware of that premise, because I think when I was in school, I knew people when we were going to like middle school and high school, that people went to different types of schools. Some people went to magnet schools, some people went to a school in a different city. So I've been aware of that in general. So even stuff like that. So that's huge. So with that said, my follow-up question is, how do we do that? How do we start changing the mindset of education? How do we incentivize these communities that education's very valuable and important? How do we change that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. A lot of people need to start with themselves. It's starting by looking inwards. I know you were talking about that critical thinking. It's having a conversation, whether it's with your partner, whether it's with your guardian or your parent, whether it's with your friend or even just a stranger. Like, like it's having a conversation about what does it mean? Like, what are my values? Like, who am I? Starting to really deconstruct, and then what do you want to do about it? Because not enough people are kind of passionate about this inequality. That we need to get more people involved. We need to think about, well, are people educated on this issue? Like when you look at certain things, it's just like not everyone's educated. Meeting people with where they're at, starting that conversation in your community, or grab a friend or join a group that's already starting it. That's where the change happens. Is by sitting with your feelings, by understanding it internally and externally as well. So I think that's like a good starting point, and that can be said for a lot of issues. But a lot of it is get educated, is like do the research, learn a bit more. A lot of the stuff that I was saying is what we call evidence-based research. I can point to the exact author and the titles of like each of the points that I have. I have a whole like spreadsheet because this is my researcher brain. I have a whole matrix of different literature that like I've looked into. It's public literature too. Some of it's from Google Scholar, some of it's from the library, all this jazz and all that stuff. But I can pinpoint each part and say, this is who said it, this is how they did their study, next. But it's making that accessible to people because I know I have the privilege of having a higher education and not everyone has that, which that's fine. But then how do we have these conversations where you make information accessible? That's a part of the conversation, is having conversations with people who have similar ideas, different ideas, thinking about people who are different politically or academically, and then finding a common ground to connect, because that's not happening enough. That's part of the reason with mental health and with academia and understanding yourself and others better, is that people need to establish that common ground and say, hey, like, this is who I am. Let's find our differences, and then let's connect on our similarities, and then understand who we are and where we're coming from. It's not just sympathy, which is like, oh, that must be so hard. It's empathy. It's I'm trying to empathize as much as possible with another person. So that's kind of where I would approach it, like from education wise. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I think that's like excellent. But my thing about that is, I think that only applies to people like yourself, very educated, very smart, and willing to improve yourself. So we got to focus on the people that don't want to do that, the people who have the mindset that they don't want to improve, the parents that are not trying to improve their kids, a very dysfunctional home, these kids that are like too influenced by these social media entertainers that want to become YouTubers even though they have no skills for it because they don't know what they're doing. These even these situations where it's very dangerous for a lot of these kids. You mentioned gang violence, for example. So how should we kind of incentivize these people? Because these are the people that need the help. Is it the government getting involved? Is it the people in the community getting incentivized to get involved? What is the solution for those people?
Yeah, I think the solution really kind of comes from these people seeing others with social power. That's what we call it, the influencers, all that stuff. These people have social power. So sure, the celebrities and people could post about the importance of it. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to the individual. And sure, there are people like me who are willing to have those conversations. And then there are people who are unwilling. But I can't force you to change. That has to come from you. And if you don't feel ready now, you know what I do? I'm going to plant some seeds. I'm going to plant these nuggets of knowledge. I'm going to plant, what I know. And when I have conversations with people, a lot of different people with me, I meet them where they're at. I don't talk all like froofy, like education language. I meet them where they're at using language that's accessible to them. And then we go from there. And then maybe someone else will converse. Change takes time. I can't just snap my finger and be like, and we're there. This is going to take hundreds of years. It took us hundreds of years to get into this, and it's going to take us hundreds of years out. So to me, I think for those people, it's planting those nuggets of knowledge, those little seeds. And yes, some of them won't grow, but that's okay because we can keep planting them.
and you're going to keep planting them because someday one of them is going to grow, and that's where the change happens. But it's being patient because, I might have planted a seed 10 years ago, and all of a sudden it's a late bloomer. It just finally grew. But I have to be okay with that and say, I'm not going to force that to grow. I will give it water. I will give it soil. I will give it all these different things. And same thing with people. I can give them all the knowledge. I can do every single thing I can in my capacity. I could, link them to resources and all sorts of other people. And if they don't want to change, they're not. But I can start to plant those little seeds mentally. I can start to plant those seeds educationally so that maybe someday they will reach that destination. And not everyone's going to change, and that's okay. We're just going to have to keep living and learning in life together. And that's just, at the end of the day, that's life. I wish I could change everyone, but at the same time, that's not the way it's made. We're going to continue to have this discourse. I'm going to continue to disagree with people, but I learn from it every time. Every time I'm like, ooh, thank you. Like, I learned a bit about myself. I learned a bit about you. I don't know if you're understanding it this way, but I'm willing to walk this path together, even if it's for half an hour or an hour or whatever time. Our paths crossed. We got to know each other in some capacity, whether we agree, disagree, whatever. That's fine. We got to have that point and plant seeds with each other. Sure, there might be some that are more positive than others, but again, this is a part of the journey. Like, some gardens die, and that happens because then it creates better soil. Some of it's toxic. Well, I got to learn how to make it better, and a lot of this is a part of the learning experience. There's no, like you were saying, there's no right or wrong to it. It's just, this is how we live, learn, and grow, literally and metaphorically.
Very true. So I want to build on that. The thing that you were talking about, because I just thought of it just now. So what do you say about this, right? So for people like yourself, for the most part, humans in general, this is not in relation to you right now, but humans in general, they need incentive to do stuff. It just is what it is. Not everybody has the pure heart to want to do things just because it's the good thing to do. They need incentive, even if it's slight. It's just some type of incentive to do stuff. It's a huge motivator. So what would you say about like these the system put in place, whether it will be given college credit, scholarship, or even just an hourly wage, creating a position for students that are willing to be successful in these public education system and set them up as mentors. I know in my public education system, there is a mentor program, but it wasn't really incentivized. The counselor reached out to me and was like, "Do you want to be a mentor?" And I just say, "Sure." I didn't really get anything out of it. I just said sure because I was like, I wasn't really doing anything in school anyway. I stopped playing sports for my last year of college. I was like, whatever. So I did it. But what if there's more incentive to increase the aspect of mentoring programs? Not everybody's doing sports. Not everybody is doing band or chorus or whatever. But if they had the incentive to get college credit, scholarship, or an hourly wage, then that would be huge. And we create this mentor program for people like them, because there will be other students, and have people like yourself that would be willing to mentor maybe 3 or 4 younger individuals that are having it tough. Let's say they don't really care about education, but create an atmosphere every now and then where they can speak with their mentor and learn from their mentor. And the seeds that you were mentioning can start getting planted because they're speaking to a peer. And we know the school hierarchy. Freshmen are going to listen to the senior. They just are, So what do you think about a program like that is mandated, introduced to like all public education systems, and it's something like that could start to help incentivizing these younger individuals to care about education more? What do you think about that solution?
Again, I think it depends on the districts, because I think, like you were saying, there's a lot of benefits, but my main cons have to do with the power dynamics, because I've seen some of these programs implemented where if you mandate it, some people might have predatory intentions. They might have racist intentions, and it creates a dynamic where it is hostile and violent. So that's my only kind of con to it. But again, it depends on the environment. It depends on the school, on the town, and all that jazz. So I think, idealistically, I think it would work for some, but I think there needs to be a lot of guidance and support from teachers, from support staff, from parents. There needs to be a buy-in. It's not just an incentive to be an incentive. There needs to be an actual buy-in socially and culturally. If there is not buy-in socially and culturally, you can do all the planning in the world and no one's going to really like want to do it. It'll be a tool used for whatever other intentions people have. So that's kind of my only caveat with that. I think a big solution that I have for a lot of public schools is offering more trade skills, because right now in public schools, there aren't many tracks where people can have that hands-on learning and say, oh, let me explore a trade that I'm interested in, whether it is within the arts, whether it's like automobiles, whether it's like woodwork and craftsmanship. That's something that I think public education could do a lot better at, is say, hey, maybe you don't want to go to college. That's fine, but maybe try some of these trade skills so that when you get out of college, you'll have a decent paying job. And here, why don't we teach some finance courses as well? Because the finances sector and offering that as a trade as well. So I think that might be a better contemporary solution within public education, in addition to the mentorship program. Because then if you have a mentor within the trade, that is hands-on skills there. It's someone directly teaching you the skills. And sure, you still might have those issues, but hey, I'd rather learn from my peer than my teacher. And oh, look, now they're modeling the behavior of what I can now become, which is great. So I think that it would need to be radical change, because the public schools and the public system would need a lot of buy-in, especially with the trade element, because some schools have the ability and resources to already offer that, and some of them don't. But it's being able to fund that, and then fund teachers and the students to be able to pursue some of their passions.
Okay, fair enough. I would say for the most part, in terms of the trade stuff, that trade is definitely something that, another thing that I do think that should be incentivized more, because there's a lot of skills that can be taught that should be something that everybody should be introduced to at the very least. So I agree that trade is very important. How they implement it and whether or not these kids will care will be another question, but I do think it should be implemented in all schools. In terms of art, I don't know, like for my schools it was, but I don't know about these other schools. If they're not, they definitely should be, right? In terms of the mentoring thing, the last thing I'll say about it is I do think for the most part they need to be chosen carefully in terms of the individuals. We can't just give it to anybody to be a mentor, because not everybody's qualified to be a mentor. It might be a scumbag, like you said. There obviously should be ways to mitigate risk, and obviously it should be in a controlled environment anytime these students are meeting with the other students. So it shouldn't be like you're going to their house and doing whatever. It should be in a controlled environment in the institution itself, and there's plenty of time throughout. Like, for example, if it's a senior, I'm sure there's one class that he doesn't have class. So he comes and he or she does whatever in terms of setting up a meeting inside the institution. But obviously it's a general idea. Both are general ideas that should be fine-tuned to make sure that the pros and cons weigh appropriately and the outcome has at least benefit. Because in the mentoring stuff, there's an incentive. Will the incentive of credit, scholarship, or hourly wage outweigh any potential negatives? And for the trade, would the incentive of implementing trade in these schools outweigh these students not caring and not doing anything with these classes in the first place? So there's a lot of factors that need to go into it. So I think for the most part, though, the initial idea, kind of combining them, has a lot of value. So that's all I got for today. I think we touched upon a lot of very interesting information in terms of education and equality, and touch upon a lot more specific ideas in terms of the problems with education and equality today. And there's even bigger discussions to be made in terms of cultural mindset, social mindset, even in these areas beyond education and equality, that I think should definitely be discussed about. Any final words for yourself?
No, I appreciate you having me. Stay educated, and if you're not sure, lean into your community. Start to look into things where it's like, wow, I don't know much about this. Why don't I get educated? And see what your community has, because there are a lot of mentorship programs, even from like adults to youth and youth to youth. So see what your community has for educational resources. How can you volunteer or get involved? Can you help sponsor or support other students? So I just thank you for having me. I was like having a great conversation.
All right, it's excellent. And before we wrap up, something that I like to do, because I have a lot of questions, very abstract questions, very big thought questions. So I just want your quick answer. You don't have to go in depth with it because these questions are conversations. So just your quick thoughts for it. So my question I'm going to ask you, that's on my top of my list that I have. These are things that I think about myself, but I might as well ask someone else as well. So in terms of your initial thoughts about this question, are human instincts and human emotions the same thing?
Kind of, but depends on the context. That's the shortest I can keep it.
Interesting. Yeah, it's something to think about. Like I said, it's a whole conversation. I had a conversation with someone before, and human instinct and human emotions. There's a conversation there, and there's something even deeper there to dive into. So that's all we got today. Do you want to plug anything else before we wrap it up?
Yeah, if you'd like to follow some of the groups that I'm a part of, I'm a part of the National Black Cooperative. You can find us on Instagram. We do a lot of live posts. We also have a podcast that we've been adding on to where we kind of have very similar conversations like this, except we fine-tune them towards a lot of contemporary issues that you might see on the news. And there are a lot of different presentations of information. The Town of Windsor Human Relations Commission that I'm a part of, we're hosting our conversation series online. So we're having community conversations on different issues like this, like education and things like that. Our next event is on November 19th, which is a Saturday, and it'll be held virtually from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you'd like, you can check out our upcoming event. And you can find us at the Town of Windsor Human Relations Commission online. So you can find all of our different conversations from 2020 all the way up to present, where we do a deep dive and all sorts of different things.
All right, excellent. So with that said, hope you guys enjoyed. Appreciate you coming on, Castella. A great conversation, of course. Very interesting solutions and discussions that was had here. You all have a good one. Rated 5 stars on Apple and Spotify. Take care and peace.